Here's my LEGO Technic model of a Chevrolet Corvette ZR1 drivetrain. So the features we've got are the V8 engine, a clutch, a realistic joystick-operated 7+ reverse manual transmission, and a semi-locking differential, and suspension. So I'll get into those now. So drive is just powered by this button, using a Power Functions large motor and rechargeable battery. So you can see the V8 running here. Then we've got the clutch. So the engine runs this wheel here, and then this here is attached to the drivetrain by the shifter part here, which is then pinched between some rubber parts, with the effect being that it can slide because the transmission part can slide on axles, but it's also driven. And the rubber parts just kind of pinch it so that the wheel actually stays in phase with the shifter, like it doesn't slide away from it. So the clutch, then it's got this lever here, which presses against the red part, and it is spring-loaded, so you can pull it out like this to disengage the clutch, but I've actually got a knob for that. It just moves it like this. Now that's on. If I run the engine, this clutch is no longer moving. You can bring it back in and it starts again. Bring it out and it stops. So, it's a somewhat realistic clutch, but it's really hard to do in LEGO. I'll leave the gearbox for later, but we've got the differential here. So, on the 1/2 shaft we've got this tire that can somewhat slide freely. They tend to have looser ends, and I chose the loosest one I could find. And then there's a little spring from a small shock absorber pinched between the wheel and the differential, so it can slide up against it, but it will automatically spring out. But then we've got this little beam here, which is attached to a worm gear assembly, so I can press it against the differential. So it's basically trying to simulate the electronic differential on the real car, which is able to allow basically varying degrees of differential lock. So with this you can run it tight or loose to allow it to slip at different points, or essentially completely lock it. So I'll throw in some gear, let in the clutch. This is the reverse. So right now we can easily slip it. It's not engaged at all. I'll move it a bit closer so there's some contact. Okay. Now it's touching. So the other one, they're both moving, but I can still slip it. It just strains the motor a fair bit. Then if I crank it up a bit tighter, if I grab one wheel, it is just flipping up at the clutch. It will not do it anymore. So it's essentially completely locked then. So that was just a fun little feature I added. The focus is on the transmission, but when I can, I'll add other things. Then one more I guess I'll get into right now is the suspension. So it's just a double wishbone design here. But I wanted to do something to replicate the Corvette's transverse leaf spring setup that it's used for a long time. It doesn't anymore, but I think this is the 7th generation, which is what I was modeling, still used it. So it just got the double wishbone, but then in the real car that seems like it essentially has just a straight bar with 2 pivots, and then hooked up to each wishbone. So when it moves up, it just has to bend the leaf spring. I kind of modeled it using these yellow beams so you could tell them apart. But, I mean, in LEGO it's just kind of generic bending. But it works. And again, it's something else to add. So the focus of the gearbox was to try to make it mechanically realistic and have a bunch of speeds. So mechanically, a real gearbox would just have 2 shafts, the input and the output, with a bunch of different gear sizes on it, plus maybe plus a 3rd shaft for the reverse gear. So mine is the same. Up here you can see we got 8-tooth gear running 24-tooth differential. That's my lowest gear, 1:3 ratio. Then we've got a black 12-tooth gear in there, running this blue gear, that one, for 2nd gear at the 3:5 ratio. Then, because LEGO doesn't actually have very many clutch gear sizes, to get enough gear, they had to resort to using one of my favorite parts, the old 14-tooth gear. So now I've got a 14:20 ratio right here, which is just slightly less low than the 12:20 we already had. Then we got a simple 1:1, 16:16. then we start going the other way. So we have to move the driving rings to the top now, and it just goes the opposite. So we got 20 to 14, 20 to 12, and 24 to 8. And the reverse gear is a little different. We've got 16 to 20 here on my extra shaft for reverse, then 12 to 24, so it is the lowest gear here. I forget what the exact ratio is, but because it has the extra shaft, it goes in the opposite direction. Well, it's a little bit tricky to make a realistic transmission like this with limited LEGO parts. It wasn't super challenging. The biggest challenge for me was getting the joystick to work realistically. I had a hard time figuring out how a shift linkage actually works in a car. This may not be right, but it was kind of the guess I had. So, I've got 4 independently moving parts on here. We've got that one, we've got this one, we've got this one, and we've got this one. So all 4 of those, they've basically got this track here that my joystick, which also moves independently, can slide through, and engage with different ones at a different time. So if it's out here, it's engaged with this one. If I move it back a little, it'll engage with this one, or this one, or the last one. And then, by moving the joystick, you can move the whole assembly it's attached to. So, like, that's the idea there. I think this might be how it realistically works. And then we've got a long linkage running back here to actually change the gear. So we've got a realistic shift pattern here with first gear here. Move this, then second. So first, second, then move it in a stage, third, fourth, move it in another stage, then we got fifth, wait, oh, I moved it too far, fifth, and, yeah, I moved it too far, again, fifth, and sixth, and then move it in all the way, we got seventh, and reverse, which is after seventh. However, this last one seems to have problems. The biggest issue, honestly, is the way that I had to attach the joystick. So if you see here, we've got the whole thing. The axle does not go all the way through because my joystick has to go there. Then I've got the shock absorber there just to make for the tightest possible fit. But then this just pops in between these two 1x1 circular plates, so it's really not very strong. For most of the gear that works fine, but for some reason this longest one has its difficulties. Now it seems to be working. So, yeah. I always love joysticks for manual shifters in LEGO. Alright, I will now show it functioning, actually shifting through the gears. So we've got the engine running and the clutch engaged, so we can start shifting. Here we've got first gear up there driving the 24 piece, so it's running fairly slow. Then the joystick, again, it always pops out if you put too much force on it. So I'm going to be shifting from here where it's not actually popping out. So now we're in a second. Going on the other end, driving a 22 gear. I'm not going to show that every time. Then back to the middle. Then third gear. Then, oops, not that one. Fourth gear, a bit faster. Fifth gear, I believe. Yeah. No, not that one. Wait, no, that was not fifth gear. I'm confused. Sorry. This. There, this is fixed. That engaged from there, the shifter in this position, moving that thing that way. I got it. And we move it back the other way. Like that. Sixth gear. Then, no. There. Seventh gear, where it's engaging here. However, it's a high gear ratio. My clutch doesn't tend to want to actually do it. Actually, I must... Okay, let's make gear on. Ah, I'm engaged in 2 gears at once. It still isn't happy about the prospect, though. I kind of have to help it along, because friction clutches aren't very good in LEGO. Okay, now I'll shift into reverse, which is my last gear. No problems there. Goes the other direction. Yeah. So this was another quick model to throw together, but it was kind of fun to actually try out a realistic gearbox setup in a sort of model. The gearbox shift linkage was quite interesting to design. Didn't end up being really strong enough at all. This would always pop out if there's too much stress involved. I'm not sure if there's a way to make it stronger without making it a lot bigger, and it's already big. But still cool to try to get a better idea of how it would work in real life. And the differential was kind of fun. Clutch, I've done it before, but it was nice to add that. So, I'm happy enough with this model, but I don't think it's anything amazing.